The world around us is hostile to the Word of God and to biblical values, but we are called to be salt and light, to stand for truth in a decaying culture. We are not called to run from the fire, but be willing to step into the fire. God has placed you at this time in history on purpose and for a purpose. Join us as we get better equipped to address civics and culture from a biblical worldview. Welcome to Into the Fire, powered by Dream City Church. Let's welcome our hosts Alison Furno and Debi and
Today's topic is the need for abortion a failure of community? We are joined by founder and CEO of Voices for the Voiceless, Josiah Friedman. Thank you so much for joining us.
Debbie, so glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm super excited about this topic. It's not one that is often comfortable for people, but it's important to have these conversations and talk about this. And I think the avenue that we're going to talk today is a little bit different than most people are used to hearing about when you're talking about abortion and about the need, that the perceived need, let's put it that way, the perceived need that people have for abortion. There is a lot involved in that, and we're going to try to tackle some of that. But I do want to start by saying that if you are listening today and you have had an abortion, or you have someone close to you that's had an abortion, know that you are loved, that there's forgiveness, there's hope, there's freedom from that there is nothing, it's not an irredeemable sin.
Yes.
And so there is freedom, there is hope. We can connect you to those resources. We have a post-abortion Bible study here at Dream City, but we can also connect you to resources elsewhere. There are lots of Bible studies and classes available. There is hope for you, and God wants you, He loves you, and He wants you to be free from that. I always like to start with that, because when we get into talking about a lot of this, it can be really difficult for people to have conversations.
Yes.
So with that, let's talk about you and your background, and how did you get started? So you started Voices in college, correct? And so how did that happen? And why did you go into this line of ministry and work and activism, or whatever you want to call it, that you do?
Yes. Well, when I was 16 years old, I was the son of a physician. I had just met Jesus. I wanted to do something for God. And so I started this group called Voices for the Voiceless. It met in my living room. It was the social club of young people who were passionate specifically about the life issue. They wanted to do something. And for me, I realized that 22% of my generation, Debbie, was aborted. Wow. And I took that very personally. And I was passionate about justice, as any young man in my position would have been.
Yes.
I gave, fire and brimstone speeches. It grew quickly. We led big political rallies. And then 3 years in, my mother sat me down on the couch and said, "I've got to tell you something. No one knows this, but I'm on a journey and you have to know." And this story, Debbie, was the most courageous thing I've ever seen anyone do in front of me. And she told me her abortion story.
Wow.
It was something that she had borne in secrecy and silence for 30 years. She had an abortion because her family was well known in her community in White Bear Lake, Minnesota. And she just couldn't bear that anything would tarnish that reputation. And so when she found out she was pregnant, she went to Planned Parenthood and they said, "You can go to this hospital and get this taken care of discreetly and no one will have to know." And so she did. She went to the hospital. She had the abortion. Debbie, 2 days later, she was bleeding everywhere. She had to be rushed back to the hospital.
Wow.
Her worried parents came and visited her, and she made up some reason why she was there. An insurance bill came in the mail 2 weeks later describing her condition. She found it before her dad came home and went back to the hospital and said, "You promised no one would have to know. You have to change this." And so they did. They changed what was on the bill that she got treated for, sent her home. And for 30 years, my mother just dealt with this wound in silence. And it was really an unredeemed wound, a wound that was closed to the healing power of Jesus, until maybe about 30 years later, when her oldest son started pressing aggressively on that wound without realizing it.
Wow.
And that story, I think it's what we're here to talk about. It's what you started this episode with, which is the healing power of Jesus does something in us that changes the world and can use us to change the world. And when I heard that story, my fire for this cause probably would have ended. There were plenty of people who, for me as a young man, didn't think my voice belonged in any capacity. But when I heard my mom's story, there was a paradigm shift from this is about justice to maybe most people who get abortions in the United States are just like my mom. They're not making a choice. They don't feel like they have one.
Right.
Abortion seems to be the only path forward to live any sort of bright future. At least that's what the world tells them, and that's what the people in their lives are telling them. And so they believe it. And it began in me a curiosity about this issue. Was it really about this? Were there hundreds of thousands of people in the United States every year who felt like abortion was their only choice? And that's why they were doing it.
Wow. And I love that so much. And I met you way back when you were first starting. I don't remember at what point, if it was before or after you had that, probably after, because I think you were in college when I first met you and learned about voices. And I just always thought you had such a great voice on this and a unique perspective on it, and without knowing the story of your mother. But I will say that I have been leading post-abortion Bible studies here at Dream City for 15 years, and that story is very common. The details are different, but often, 30, 40, 50 years that women have carried it, going to church, serving in church, working in the nursery, working in the office, whatever, stories across the country that I've heard and they're holding it this secret, and they've never talked about it to anybody because they don't feel like they can. And I also had a similar of starting off kind of more in a political space. When I first started in my journey with the life issue, it was the political arena. And I'm still involved on that end, very involved in following legislation, doing all of that. But there was a point at which, it was in about 2010, I was in church and I was praying, and I worship. I don't remember exactly this situation of whether it was at the end of service, beginning of service, but the Lord just really, I felt like He spoke to me and said, just to look at the body in the building and say, we need to make church a place where women are willing to run to rather than run from when they've had an abortion or if they're facing an unplanned pregnancy. Because we know that they don't talk to that's not typically the first place where women will come for help, because they're afraid of being judged. They're afraid of reputations. I mean, I've talked to women who were in Bible college or whose parents were pastors, and they specifically got the abortion because they didn't want anyone to know what was going on in their life. Whether the parents had pressured them into that, or whether they themselves were pressured into it. But you just never know. And so whenever I'm talking, I always try to be sensitive to the fact that someone listening to me has had that experience. And so we need to speak the truth, but we need to have that hope and that love of Jesus in there, to where they're willing to come talk to you like your mom was willing to come talk to you.
Yes. Amen. And it takes extraordinary courage to come and open up about that. But there's such power in it. Debi, this year, about 40% of the women who get abortions, it won't be their first one. And that means that people don't find healing. Their circumstances don't change, and they find themselves in the same journey over and over again. And they might not want an abortion, but they might not see any other path. Our capacity as people who follow Jesus, who've been healed from the inside out from our greatest wounds, like abortion, that is a capacity that needs to be shared with the world, and it is urgent, because so many people in our community are only finding healing 20 or 30 years after this, and this can control your life. And we need to invite people into that far earlier.
Well, and it can cause women to spiral too. I've talked to many, I've seen that, where spiraling into more risky behavior, drug use, self-harm, thoughts of suicide, all of those things that can happen because of having an abortion, which then lead to 2, 3, 4 more abortions because of leading a riskier lifestyle, because they feel that unhealed wound is there. And that trauma, it's a trauma. So with that, we kind of talked about this a little bit, but how is the messaging important? In what ways is messaging important in changing the conversation around abortion? We've talked about it a little bit, but let's talk about it specifically.
I think messaging is critical, because I think most people on both sides don't really understand God's kingdom vision for what we're actually trying to do. look, this has been a war in our culture for 52 years, people going back and forth and back and forth. It is an issue that controls American politics and is very pronounced here in Arizona. We're the center of it all. But I'm not sure that people know what we're actually fighting for. And I think if they did, they'd understand that our cause is an amazing cause. The truth of the matter is, I've heard many people since Roe was overturned say that the goal of the life movement, our next frontier, is to make abortion unthinkable. And I think that's a mistake, because I think we could make abortion unthinkable. Now, follow me here. I think we could make abortion unthinkable without actually helping anybody to choose life.
Right.
Being unthinkable just means something retreats into the deep recesses of isolated society. And the truth is, today, abortion is a failure of community. People walking through abortion don't feel like they have any other choice and don't have the support of their partners, workplaces, healthcare professionals, so many people around their lives. And we need to fundamentally change that. So for our team and for different leaders in the movement, we've urged a different end goal that I think is actually more representative of God's heart in this whole thing. If you view abortion as fundamentally Satan and evil getting in between the most precious biological relationship that God made between mother and child and saying to her, only one of you gets a bright future.
Right.
You get to pick.
Yeah.
That's the vision of pro-choice. That's what it is. That's the choice that we're talking about. And it's not a good enough vision. Our vision should be to make motherhood a path of success. In Arizona, if you were to make that into a question, the vision of the life movement is to consider, how can we make Arizona the best place in the world to have a child? How can we reunite the interests of mother and child and end the zero-sum game forever? Now, if you think about that language and who should resonate with that, it's not just Republicans.
Right.
It's everybody.
Yeah.
It's anybody who actually believes that mothers and children thriving together is the society that we all want.
Right.
That's the pro-life vision, and it should resonate with everyone.
Yeah. Now, I will say they probably have different ideas of how that should be accomplished, right? In whether it's coming from government programs or coming from other types of help. The way to get there is going to be different depending on which side of the political aisle you're on.
Yes.
But the goal, should be the same. It shouldn't be that you have to choose that if you are a woman and you're pregnant, that your child is somehow now your enemy and you have to, only one of you can survive out of that or thrive. I love that way of looking at it, because really that should be our goal, is that both should be able to succeed and thrive and be protected. Yeah, that's really good.
That's our vision. It's the reunification of the interests of mother and child. That's what we're fighting for. And you're right. People on both sides of the spectrum will think about things differently. And for my small government friends, of which many are key linchpins in the life movement, and I think this message also applies to big government people, right? People are all over the place, but we should be able to come around this vision. We also should be able to really insist on open-mindedness for whatever's actually going to equip her to move forward in a really meaningful way, whether that be government policies or things that we can do in the private sector or in the church to better support her.
Because it really is a very comprehensive need. It's a comprehensive problem.
Right.
And requires some innovative thinking.
It does.
And so with that, the next question is, in what types of cultural or systemic things need to change in order to lessen that perceived need for abortion? And we touched on a couple of them already.
Yeah.
But what do you see as some things that in society, in the system of the way things are done, that cause that enmity between mother and child?
Right. I think there's one situation that's causing a lot of issues that I'll get to in a second. But there's two systems that I think contribute to this that need to be changed. One is the workplace. You might have noticed this after Roe is overturned, right? There were 200 big companies in the United States that said, we all pledge that we will pay for our employees out-of-state abortions.
Right.
They might have not had maternity leave in any way, shape, or form, but they were going to do that. And that sends a certain message to her.
It does.
Right? That everything I've worked for to this point, is it just over? Is that it? Right? Now, she might choose to be a stay-at-home mom or any option, right, that she may move forward. But if having a child means the end of everything she's worked for in that space because of what her workplace is telling her, that's a huge problem. And it drives hundreds of thousands of abortions in the United States every year.
Yeah, I said a lot about that in 20.
Yes.
I think it was 2020, or I don't remember when it was, but time has no meaning since COVID. It's like COVID broke time, and I can't tell whether things were last year or 5 years ago. Do you have the same problem? I'm older than you, but
yes, yeah, but you were speaking to it. You saw it right away.
I did, because it just was so glaring that you have these companies that, like you said, that are willing to pay for someone to go out of state for an abortion, but they're not willing to help support someone who wants to have a baby and still continue to work to provide, help with that. And it also, I think one of the things that I talked about at the time, which is super interesting to me, is that the original feminists, right, they were working for things like that, right? They were working for poor working women to have better care, to have health care, and to have better work environments, right, where they were getting that support at work and getting things like equal pay and all of those things that the left talks about now, but really abortion sidelined. Because when it came into the 60s and you had all of the push for sexual freedom and abortion rights and all of those things, all of that other stuff went to the side.
Yes.
And so you're still having those kinds of conversations of, even with single mothers or whatever, all of these issues that were the case in the 30s, and that the original feminists that helped get women the right to vote, they were trying to work on those things, and they got pushed out of the conversation because they were trying to push for sex and for abortion.
I think that's an often not realized thing that's happened in our movement that's critical to understand. Mainly that when we talk about this, I mean, there's such a huge difference that can be made by an employer who believes that if any of my employees get pregnant, they should know that I'm there for them, that we're flexible, that we'll make a way. That have an abundant mindset. The people who need to model that are the people who believe in the dignity of human life. Because as you've hit on, if you don't really believe in the dignity of every human life, you wouldn't think it's this way, but women do not advance when we lose that value. If you're just treating a woman like a man, right? And it's equivalent, right? The same way. And you're not actually empowering her to show up as a woman, as somebody who can be a mother. Right. Then that's deeply limiting. And the feminist movement has limits for how much progress it can make if it deeply believes in abortion.
Yeah. We kind of got sidetracked, but so the workplace is one of them. What else is another area?
I think healthcare is a critical area. I think as you look around the United States right now and you think about the disability termination rate, that's after parents get a prenatal diagnosis of Down syndrome, spina bifida, cystic fibrosis, a full range of other conditions, many of which are not life-limiting, by the way.
Right.
They're told by their physician, I'm so sorry, here's how many days you have left to get an abortion. And they're not given access to the full range of resources that are now available. It's the best time ever to be born with a disability.
Right.
And the modern world has created so many pathways to success in that regard, and yet those are never presented at the point of diagnosis. And because of the way that diagnosis is framed in healthcare, which has been weaponized by the abortion industry for a long time, you are seeing so many parents not get the information that they deserve and make a decision that they later look back on as they get to know the disability community a little bit more and the disability community becomes more visible and go, man, I wish I would have had that information.
Right.
And I think it's a critical place where we have to think, how can we begin to empower people in that space? So physicians, nurses, healthcare professionals, people who speak to the dignity of every human being to whom everyone listens. It's those people in our society who we take more seriously about their views on this than anyone. They need to speak up loud and clear right now.
And I know that that's true. I know lots of women who have had that happen to them, right? So even just having twins with one having an issue in the womb, and they're told to have a reduction, right, and terminate one of the babies. Yes. That's the first thing that they recommend, right? And that should not be the first thing. That should be well, it shouldn't be at all, but it should definitely not be the first thing that's recommended. But it seems to be the go-to.
Yeah.
That's your very first thing. And I wonder, I mean, I don't really know how much of this is training, how much of it is their worldview, how much of it is, I know that there have been cases where doctors have been sued because they didn't give that information, and then someone had a baby they sue the doctor for not telling them
Right.
the information. So it's kind of a complex issue, but what do you think as far as the culprit of why we're in this state right now?
I think it primarily has to do with two things. One is training, and one is simply making it extremely hard to get through medical school if you are a person of faith or conscience. Yeah. And so those are two things we need to solve over the long term. They are part of the breakdown in community that we talk about that's causing so many people to feel like abortion's their only choice. And it's going to be a journey to change them. But already we're seeing some really, promising returns in those regards. One of the reasons it's important long-term, and my job at Voices for the Voiceless is really to think about what are the ways we need to change the culture so that 20 years from now, you and I are having a different conversation. Right. We are living in a culture of life. That value that we have has been passed down a generation, and we live in a place where everyone knows that they have support to thrive on a motherhood journey. That's the vision. So I'm thinking about long-term, and I'm thinking about long-term threats too. One of the things we really need to think about is that the number of conditions, prenatal diagnosis is a technology. The number of conditions we can detect today is only a fraction of what we will be able to detect in 10 years. So if we don't get this right, if we don't change that culture in medicine, we're not talking about a small percentage of abortions anymore. We're talking about a very large percentage that is diagnosing any kind of imperfection or anything that's not ideal in a human being that might be conceived.
Right.
That culture needs to be done away with. And so we have to work very hard to change it.
Yeah. And I mean, you get into a whole lot of tangents on that too with what you were saying about the training and the difficulty of getting people of faith through. I know a lot of people are having trouble finding pediatricians or OBGYNs that are not telling them horrible things, right, or are willing to work with them on what they want to have, what kind of medical care they want for themselves or for their children. And then you've got the whole IVF tangent too, which we won't get into because that could be a whole episode in and of itself. But there's a lot of ethical concerns with that, with what you're talking about, where you are handpicking children, right? You are creating this idea of creating perfect children, which is eugenics. Right. And so when you get into that idea, as medical science advances, you have more and more of that whether it's a natural pregnancy that you are, being encouraged to terminate because of some disability, or whether it's through artificial ways of getting pregnant like IVF, the goal is to create a problem-free perfect child that you have the certain sex or the certain hair color or whatever. That's eugenics, and we don't think about it in those terms because you just kind of get wrapped up in the middle of it, and it's exciting and new and all these different things that you can have. And if you have trouble having kids, or you have a history of illness in your family or whatever, there's a lot of emotional things that can come in and create feelings about it, right? But it does create a lot of moral and ethical issues that need to be resolved, because there is a really dark side to all of that as well.
Absolutely. And the dark side, I mean, to transition into the broader issue here, the dark side of this is really, it's really that evil comes in when people are isolated. Yeah. God designed us for community, to walk in a space where we're supported by the people around us. And abortion thrives in the darkness when people are most isolated. One of the things, and I hope people understand this, but I think people are just coming to realize it, if they're even only the ones who are paying attention too.
Right.
The biggest change after the overturn of Roe wasn't that the politics were different in the states. The biggest change that affected this issue was that the abortion pill could now be purchased on the internet, mailed to your home, and you didn't have to interact with a healthcare professional or a single living soul. You could walk through that in complete isolation.
Isolation, yeah.
Never have we lived in a time when abortion was that isolating. It is a weird thing to say, but at least at Planned Parenthood, you had to walk up to someone who would give you the pills and give you instructions. And that's fundamentally changed the game. We did some, one of the things we're doing at Voices for the Voiceless is coming up with new ways, kind of new generation ways of being able to reach people who are feeling especially isolated, and help them know that there really is support in the middle of that decision-making process. And as we have gone about the work of doing that, we have seen everything that those who are trying to profit off of abortion pill sales are doing. Right? They're running ads. The biggest company that sells abortion pills is not Planned Parenthood. The biggest company that's selling pills and mailing them to people's homes is 8Access. It's a company outside of the United States, and it's using now certain physicians in the United States. It's sending them a stockpile of pills and then having them prescribe those pills and mail them anywhere in the United States, including in Arizona where it's illegal to do.
Where it's illegal to do it, yeah.
There's just no enforcement mechanism. And if this is how it's going to be, Debbie, if our options are limited for our legal intervention in this, we have to realize that in some ways, abortion has become like our fentanyl issue, right? It's accessible. The laws aren't going to be able to fully patch this up. We're going to have to find a way to walk with people in community. Now, that's not to say the laws aren't important, because they are. They're a critical piece of what it means to build a culture of life over the long term.
But they're not enough.
They're not enough. Yeah. They're not enough. And we have to find ways to be able to reach people. And we have to operate like that. So people in our churches, in our spaces, need to know that the people who are walking through abortion in your community, they might have done that recently without telling anyone.
Right.
There's never been more urgency to tell people in your life, whether they be your kids or friends, whatever, that you will be there for them if ever they are dealing with a situation that seems bleak, where they lose hope for their future. You'll be there for them just as a person to talk to.
Yeah.
As soon as you bring someone out of isolation, it's a game changer, but we have to be more proactive than ever because of how this has changed.
I 100% agree with that. And just if you're looking for a way to do this, I mean, again, saying it face-to-face with people, this is something I've done for years on social media, is if I'm posting anything about this topic, I always, or at least try to always, have a little, just one line at the end that if you are pregnant and you need help, or you've had an abortion and you want somebody to talk to, contact me and I'll help you. So that it's just that little, and it's amazing how many people have reached out to me.
Yes.
People I don't know that have reached out to me because they're looking for that. They're looking for that community. Because like we said at the beginning, to tie it around, and you went into that next question about the abortion pill. That was going to be my next question.
Sorry, Debbie.
It was perfect.
Yeah.
It was a perfect transition, because I did want to talk about
the
abortion pill, because it's over 60% now of abortions that you're getting without any kind of human contact, which again leads to a whole bunch of other issues which we don't need to get into, but with not knowing the gestational age, or if it's an ectopic pregnancy, or it creates a lot of dangers.
It does.
Helping predators that can then give a girl an abortion pill and continue to abuse her without anybody ever knowing, because again you're losing that point of human contact. But aside from all of that, it's that isolation piece that it makes it easier, anything that, because it's something that women have always wanted to kind of keep secret. And if it's easier to do that, then it's more isolating. And there, to know that there's that community there, to know that there's somebody, it's amazing how women will take that lifeline, because they really largely do not really want to have an abortion. They feel like they don't have another option. They feel like it's the only thing that they can do. So if they're given a lifeline of some sort, they will take it.
If you were living in a space going through a hard time, and all you could hear was somebody telling you, everything you've worked for, it's probably going to disappear. Or there's just, I'm not sure how bright your future is going to be if you take this step. Or I'm not sure I'm going to be in your life if you take this step.
Right.
If you heard those things, you'd be much less prone to make a decision that's the best for your future. You'd be making a decision in scarcity mode.
Right.
And, there's this passage in Scripture It's very simple, where it just talks about the economics of our faith. And it talks about who loved who first, right? The chicken or the egg. It says, we love because he first loved us. And that's how humans work.
Right.
We are invested in a magnificent way by Jesus, and then we can act out of love. And before that, who knows? But we're not prone to do that at all.
Right.
And the truth is that's why we need community in her life and her space. Hard to expect somebody to make a bold and courageous choice when the only thing going into them from the systems they're a part of and their workplace and their partner and their physician,
Family sometimes,
is you can't do this.
right.
And if that's the only message she's hearing, making a decision that courageous is extremely difficult.
Yes.
You and I don't make those courageous decisions if that's the input we're getting.
Right.
And so that's why it's important to be proactive about what you say.
Yeah. And I have found over the years that really, honestly, the main thing, they just need to know that someone is in their corner, that someone cares. I care what happens to you. I care what happens to your baby, but I
Yes.
care what happens to you. Right.
Right.
So that just hearing that is an empowering thing, that then all of the rest of it can be figured out. Right. But if they know that they have somebody that is in their corner, then it really does make a big difference. So just in keeping that in mind, I think that's a really good thing when we're talking to people. Again, we talked about it at the beginning, that trying to make sure that when you're talking to people that you remember that someone within the sound of your voice may have had an abortion or paid for an abortion or had someone abort a baby that they didn't want aborted, or whatever the case is, because it affects both men and women. And just knowing that as you're saying those things, to keep that in mind so that it doesn't come across so harsh.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Amen.
We've talked about this quite a bit on this show, but about how people tend to either be way on the mercy side or way on the truth side, and it's either you overlook and justify every behavior to the point of ignoring the truth, or you just come across all truth, and I would never trust you with my deepest, darkest secrets because
Right.
you're not trustworthy.
Yes.
And you're mean, right? So we tend to kind of naturally go to one direction or the other, and Jesus was both. And so we have to learn which way we kind of are naturally skewed to be, and try to work on the other one. Right?
I think that's the hardest thing. Yeah. And maybe not overlooking too, when you're thinking about what's the dent I can make in a post-row world, there is the thing you say to your children and your friends. There's also the thing you say to the business leaders you know. There's the thing you say to the doctors you know. There's the thing you say to the church that you're in. Because all these systems and structures that we use that are supposed to be there for people to thrive, right now they're mechanisms that force people into abortion. Mm-hmm. And we have to change all of them. So realize that you're also in your life, you no doubt have influence with people who can absolutely change the story of at least one person and maybe many.
Yeah. And with that, we'll talk at the very end about just last words of recommendations for if you're what you can do in church and in your personal life to do that. But I do want to touch on the fact that we have a ballot initiative that they're about to submit their signatures for next week. That is an extreme abortion ballot initiative, and it actually kind of overlaps into what we're talking about. Even though we're saying that you need to the legislation, we also need the community. But this ballot initiative would really affect the ability of communities to do that, because right now abortion is legal through 15 weeks in Arizona, with exceptions if the mother's life is in danger, with medical exceptions. This initiative would make it legal through all 9 months, even though it says it through 24 weeks. It's the way that it's worded. It opens the door to, we've seen with other court cases in that language is very broad, and it can mean just about anything.
Yes.
But aside from that, it would inhibit Christian doctors from being able to refuse to participate, right? So where all of that stuff that we were talking about pushing abortion on women, that would be the norm, right? You wouldn't be allowed to take a stand in that or to interfere with those things, or as a parent to even have that conversation with your child, because it would get in between a parent and a child to where you would have 13, 14-year-olds that are able to go get an abortion without even having a conversation with their parent. So it does interfere with that ability to have community that we're talking about that's so crucial in that journey. The way that this ballot initiative, it would be a constitutional amendment, would be terrible because it would be a constitutional amendment, which is extremely hard to undo,
right,
and would make us a really extreme state on abortion and limit the ability of the church and of families and of community to make a difference in that. I mean, that's the way that I see it. Do you agree with that assessment of it?
I absolutely agree with that assessment. And to that, I would just add, as I've talked to people about this, abortion, people understand, is a significant social problem. It doesn't really matter where you're coming from, right? It's volume, how many people are walking through that situation alone, how many people in our society get pregnant and feel like there's simply no way they could make it. That's a devastating reality for the United States and for our current situation. And there are ways that many people believe that we need to get around that and create a more, pro-child, pro-mother society. But this ballot initiative doesn't guarantee that everyone has paid maternity leave. It doesn't, for some people, depends on which way you stand on this, right? It doesn't protect IVF, right? Some people in the political sphere think that's important right now. It doesn't do that. This doesn't make sure that your physician gives you access to all the resources that you would need to know the communities around you should you get a diagnosis. Its only solution to a very complex social problem is to make sure that abortion is not legal through 15 weeks, it's legal the whole time.
Right.
And
it's the preferred thing.
Yes. And that's the whole problem with this thing. We're never going to create a society that paves a way for motherhood to be a path of success if our only solution to people's pain and isolation is to sell them an abortion.
Right.
This is a very limited solution to this problem, so much so that it will restrict actual solving of the problem and putting community around people who need it most.
Yes, I agree. And so what can we do, just to final words of what a call to action of what can churches and communities do to better support women and children and young families?
I think if you have influence in your workplace, you need to consider how your policies could be amended to better support parenthood. I think if you're in healthcare, you need to consider how you can wield the influence of your voice to speak to the dignity of every human life, and how you can influence people in your space to present difficult news to a patient in a way that's really life-giving. And I think churches need to be a lot more like yours, Debi, with the strategy that you have to be proactive, come around people, make sure that there is a pathway for people to have healing and to discover healing today, not 2 decades from now, and to make sure that we actually have places that are invested enough in our community where they can provide support to people who feel really isolated. And the last thing I'll say is, as a movement, we ought to not be daunted by this moment. It's easy because of the losses that we've incurred. There were more than 1 million abortions for the first time in 10 years last year. And the reason for that has a lot to do with the abortion pill and different ways in which over time we've lost the most important institutions in American society. We have to take them back. But I would ask the audience, can you be faithful in a difficult moment without faith? The Bible defines faith as the assurance of things hoped for. In other words, we need to go in believing that the forces against us, while they may be strong, while they may be many, they could be turned around.
Yes.
There's no way to be faithful in this moment with doubt that God couldn't completely change workplace culture in America and make it pro-mother, that God couldn't completely change medicine in this country and make it a place that values the dignity of every human life, that God couldn't completely change our society so that everyone who finds out they're pregnant in a moment or situation that's difficult could envision a path where they could be successful. That can happen, but it will only happen, and we can only be faithful if we realize we serve a God who's big enough to do it.
Love that. That is a perfect way to end. So I'm just going to end with that, leave those words as the last words, because I think that's a perfect summation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you,
This
Debi.
was a fantastic conversation. So glad that you were here today.
Honored to be here. Thanks.
Thank you for joining us on Into the Fire, powered by Dream City Church.
You can listen to this podcast on Apple and Spotify and follow us on social media. Find all the info on the show notes. To learn more about Dream City Church, visit our website at dreamcitychurch.us. Thanks for listening.